Jon Snow felt as though the entire world had collapsed beneath his feet when the news reached him. Lord Eddard Stark had been executed in King's Landing. He stood in the courtyard of Castle Black, the paper in his hand trembling with the chill of truth. The words were as blunt as a sword's edge. His father was dead, branded a traitor, and there was no justice to be found under the iron rule of the boy king Joffrey Baratheon. Around him, the brothers of the Night's Watch went about their business, dragging supplies through the yard and tending to the ravens, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the cataclysmic moment Jon was living through. His grief was a phantom pain. A wound he could not see yet felt like ice in his lungs. That morning, the wall rose as stark and silent as always, uncaring of mortal politics, a monolith that separated the realms of men from the unknown dangers of the far north. Yet in Jon's heart, a storm raged. He was half a man in that moment, torn between the oath he had sworn and the furious loyalty that demanded retribution. Ned Stark had raised him, loved him in his own reserved way, taught him the importance of honor, justice, and mercy. And now that father, the only father Jon had ever truly known, was gone. For a day and a night, Jon wrestled with the choice. He had made his vows to the Night's Watch. He had given up rights to lands and titles, to father children, to hold loyalties beyond the black cloak that hung from his shoulders. But the blood inside him thundered for vengeance. In truth, he could not remain idle while the ones responsible for Lord Eddard Stark's death sat comfortably on the Iron Throne. Midnight found him in his quarters, the small space smelling of old straw and lamp oil. Ghost, his dire wolf, lay at the foot of the bed, eyes trained on Jon's every subtle movement. The white wolf sensed the turmoil in his master and gave a low, concerned whine whenever Jon's anguish spiked. Jon was no oathbreaker. He believed in what the Watch stood for, believed in defending the realm from threats most men did not believe even existed. But that night, his father's face appeared to him in feverish dreams, whispering of broken laws and the ephemeral nature of duty. If Ned Stark had been cast down as a traitor for uncovering the truth about King Joffrey, then what sense was there in letting that truth wither unchallenged? Perhaps it was not the Night's Watch that needed him most at that moment. Perhaps the realm needed something else from him. He did not want to break faith with his brothers. The vow was supposed to be for life. Yet there was a greater vow in Jon's heart, older than any oath he had ever spoken aloud. On the second day after the Raven came, the day he was meant to set off on a ranging north of the Wall, Jon slipped out under the early morning gloom, Ghost at his side. He left a note behind, explaining that he could not remain while his father's killers ruled, and that he was sorry. They would call him deserter, and the punishment for desertion was death. But Jon could not endure his own cowardice if he stayed. He needed to do something, needed to fight for his father's memory, for justice. The old sense of fairness that Ned Stark had instilled in him from childhood rang like a death knell in his ears. He rode hard and fast south. At first, he had no plan but to reach Winterfell, to stand beside his brother Robb, who had raised the banners of the North to avenge Ned. Perhaps that was all there was to do. The road was dangerous, scattered with pockets of loyalists, bandits, and soldiers from every corner of the realm. Rumors spread like wildfire. Renly Baratheon had declared himself king, forging an alliance with House Tyrell. Robb Stark was named king in the north by his bannermen. Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, rumored to be no Baratheon at all but a product of incest between Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime. Then there was Stannis Baratheon, older brother to Renly, rightful heir under the laws of succession. He had vanished to the south, or so people said, amassing supporters in secret. None seemed certain where he would strike first. Jon discovered, to his astonishment, that he was sought by more parties than he'd expected. Word had gone out, apparently, of a bastard Stark traveling alone. Some said the Lannisters would pay good coin for his capture, or at least for information. Deserters from the Night's Watch were branded as criminals, but Ned Stark's bastard might prove a valuable pawn for any side looking to discredit the North, or to gather hostages. A few brigands attempted to ambush him in a small copse of trees near a winding stream, but Ghost's fierce intervention left them howling for mercy. Jon learned to keep to the shadows of roads less traveled, moving mostly at night. He found refuge in hidden glades, or among those villagers who still remembered Ned Stark's kindness in the War of the Ninepenny Kings or Robert's Rebellion. Though Jon had no illusions, most aided him out of fear of what a direwolf might do or what might become of them if the Starks ever learned of their betrayal. He traveled alone and uncertain for weeks, crossing half the distance to Winterfell, when fate or the gods intervened. At an inn by a lonely stretch of road, he encountered a small retinue of men bearing the flaming heart of House Baratheon, the center adorned with the stag crowned in flame. 2 knights and half a dozen men-at-arms sat hunched over their ale in silence. Jon overheard them speaking in low voices. They were heading north on urgent business, carrying a message to any remaining lords of the north who might be open to swearing fealty to Stannis Baratheon, the rightful king. Jon had never spared much thought for King Stannis. He knew only that the man had a reputation for unyielding severity and a stubborn adherence to law and duty. Some disliked him for it, some feared him, but no one could doubt his sincerity. It was something Ned Stark would have admired, Jon realized. After a night spent brooding in his small room, Jon found his feet guiding him to the retinue's table at dawn. He introduced himself quietly. At first they bristled, but when they heard his name, their eyes widened. "Ned Stark's bastard," they said. "Shouldn't you be at the wall?" Jon told them he was no longer of the Watch and that he sought an audience with their lord, with King Stannis if possible. He desired justice for his father. If the rightful king was a man who cared about law and truth, then perhaps there was no better ally in seeking vengeance, or at least a path to set things right in the realm. The knights regarded him with narrowed eyes, clearly weighing the risk and reward of taking on the infamous deserter from the Night's Watch. But they, too, were short on friends. The crown was not yet secure, and Stannis' cause was overshadowed by the more charismatic Renly in the south and the warlike Robb Stark in the north. Perhaps, they reasoned, presenting Ned Stark's bastard to Stannis would gain them favor. Their journey took them to a rocky coastline near Dragonstone, where Stannis had made his seat. The castle was a grim fortress of stone gargoyles and black walls, perched upon an island that all but smelled of dragons old and dead. Gulls circled overhead, crying out in the gray sky. Jon had never seen the sea like this, dark and choppy, a living, heaving force that threatened to swallow him. Ghost stayed close, sniffing at the salt and brine with suspicion. The men ferried across in a small galley. Jon did not speak much on the voyage, choosing instead to stand near the prow, cloak whipping around him as waves battered the ship's hull. The gulls overhead reminded him of ravens, their calls grating and forlorn. When he finally stood in Stannis Baratheon's presence, his heart thundered. The king, if indeed he was the rightful king, sat in a large chair of black stone, carved with the shapes of dragons. A simple table stood before him, covered in maps. Several men were in attendance. Jon recognized Ser Davos Seaworth by the shortened fingers on his left hand. Another was tall, thin, and wore red robes that seemed incongruous in the gloom of the chamber. Her hair was a bright copper color that shone like living flame. Melisandre, the Red Woman from Ashai, priestess of R'hllor, or so the rumors said. Stannis himself was lean, his dark hair receding, jaw clenched in perpetual disapproval. His eyes had the intensity of a man who never yields. "You are the bastard son of Ned Stark," Stannis said without preamble, voice echoing in the chamber. "Brought here to me, a deserter of the Night's Watch, so I'm told." Jon did not flinch. "I am Jon Snow, your grace, and he paused, searching for the right words. "I wish to serve justice for my father and for the realm. If you are the rightful king, then I would give you my service if you would have it." Stannis narrowed his eyes. "You broke your oath, boy. That is no small crime. If my claim is true, then the laws of the realm apply here, and you would be punished as a deserter." Jon took a breath. "I understand, but my father was killed unlawfully, and the realm is in chaos. The boy who sits the Iron Throne is no son of King Robert. You know this, Lord Stark knew it. He died for it. If you need men who believe in justice, I ask that you spare my life so I can help you bring it to the Seven Kingdoms." Silence filled the hall. Melisandre watched Jon with curiosity, as though she perceived something beyond his words, something hidden beneath his skin. Ser Davos cast a worried glance at Stannis, who sat motionless and rigid, as if carved from the same black stone as Dragonstone's walls. Then the king rose from his seat. "Do you truly wish to serve the realm, or is it vengeance you want?" Jon's lips parted. He wanted to say it was both. In the end, he chose honesty. "I want to do what my father would have done. He served the realm because he believed in honor, believed in truth. I am my father's son, though I was never acknowledged as legitimate. But I would see the rightful king on the Iron Throne. Justice demands it." Stannis studied him for a long moment, then looked to Melisandre. She inclined her head in a subtle nod, lips curved into a faint smile of approval. Davos said nothing, but Jon sensed sympathy or understanding in his gaze. "It seems you have the favor of the Lord of Light," Stannis said at last, voice uncertain. "Or so I'm told. Deserter you may be, but I will not turn away a potential ally, especially not the son of Eddard Stark, a man who was not my friend, but who served my brother faithfully and died for the truth. If you are truly loyal to my cause, then you will prove it." Jon knelt on the cold stones, placing a hand on the hilt of his sword in pledge. "I will, your grace. On my father's memory, I promise to serve." Stannis barely nodded. "Rise then, Jon Snow. For now, I will consider you in my service, though I do not forget your desertion. Prove yourself worthy, and I shall grant you a pardon if I am victorious. Fail me, and not even your father's memory can save your head." Jon stood, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. He inclined his head. "Thank you, your grace." And so it began. Jon Snow found himself in the unlikely position of a young advisor, or a counselor in training, among the ranks of Stannis Baratheon's small court on Dragonstone. The fortress was as austere as its master, with few comforts or luxuries. The men who served Stannis seemed to share his temperament, hard men, proud men, clinging to their cause out of loyalty to the true line of succession, or simply out of hatred for the Lannisters. They were not numerous, but they were fiercely devoted. At first, Jon was an outsider among them, a black cloak replaced with the sigil of a flaming red heart on his breast. His presence stirred whispers. Some muttered that Ned Stark's bastard was a deserter and not to be trusted. Others remembered rumors that Eddard Stark had once suspected the truth of the royal children's parentage. If the father died for that truth, maybe the son would further it. A few resented him outright, as they saw no reason for the king to trust him. But Ser Davos Seaworth was kind enough to guide Jon through these unfamiliar waters. Davos might have been no great lord, once a smuggler who had had his fingers shortened by Stannis himself, but Jon had never met a man with more genuine loyalty and compassion. "You have to understand, lad," Davos said one evening, as they walked along the Dragonmont's parapets. "We're not many, and times are tough. Most of the realm doesn't even know Stannis is the rightful king. They see him as some rebel off in the shadows. Renly's calling himself king too, and he's far more charming. Even men who served Stannis for years think Renly might be the better bet, for alliances if nothing else. As for Joffrey, the Lannisters hold King's Landing, so they've got the gold, the city, the advantage. We're hemmed in out here on Dragonstone, hoping for a spark that'll turn into a fire." Jon nodded, gazing over the sea. The wind tugged at his dark hair. "But we have the truth, or so they say. Doesn't that matter?" Davos exhaled, shifting the stumps of his missing fingers. "Truth matters to some. Fear and ambition matter more. But King Stannis is determined. If you're going to serve him, you'd best be prepared for the challenges ahead. I hear he means to sail for Storm's End soon. That's his seat by rights. Renly has an army camped near Highgarden, last I heard. One of them will likely make a move. Whether we march first or try to treat with lords in the Stormlands, I can't say. That'll be for the king to decide." Jon thought of Robb, who had marched south as well, newly crowned king in the north. Would Robb accept Stannis' claim? Would it matter if Stannis truly was Robert Baratheon's rightful heir? The realm was fracturing into pieces, each corner naming its own king. The notion of 5 kings battling for one throne seemed absurd, But so was the world that had allowed Ned Stark to be executed so easily. Melisandre's presence unnerved Jon, though she always spoke to him with courtesy. There was something in her red-gold hair, her pale skin, her flame-colored garments that reminded him of embers that never cooled. He could almost smell smoke when she entered a room, as if fire trailed in her wake. She watched him more than she watched others. He caught her eyes often, measuring him. He overheard her once telling Stannis that the Lord of Light had great plans for bastards. Jon did not understand. Her religion was foreign to him. As far as Jon knew, the old gods spoke in the rustling of weirwoods, not in the flickering flames. But whatever misgivings he harbored, Jon worked diligently to aid Stannis' cause. He studied the histories of the Baratheons, the genealogies of the great houses, the recent movements of various forces in the realm. He had always read widely in the libraries of Winterfell and the Maester's Tower, but that knowledge had been overshadowed by his training with the sword and spear. Now, however, every snippet of learning might prove crucial. Stannis, not a patient teacher, was at least an honest man. He might bark at Jon for ignorance, but he rarely mocked him. In turn, Jon discovered he could speak his mind to Stannis, so long as he couched it respectfully. If he found an error in a plan, Stannis wanted to know it. He would not let pride or arrogance lead him astray if good sense could prevent it. Winter was approaching, though the southern parts of the realm had yet to feel its full pinch. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. The sea around Dragonstone seemed perpetually gray, giving the castle an isolated, haunted feel. Stannis' lords gathered for councils of war. Lord Celtigar, Lord Valerion, and a few others loyal to House Baratheon's older branch. They spoke of forging alliances with coastal lords in the Vale, or appealing to the river lords who might be swayed by the knowledge that Joffrey was illegitimate. But there was precious little coin to fund a great campaign, and the royal fleet had mostly gone over to King's Landing or was locked in other squabbles. Stannis' solution was as direct as the man himself. "We will send out envoys to every lord in the realm, from Dorne to the Neck," he declared one evening. "They shall carry a letter, drafted by my hand, explaining the truth of Joffrey's parentage and proclaiming me the rightful king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. It is time the realm knows what Ned Stark died for, even if it moves only a fraction of these self-serving lords to our side." Jon was there, standing at the edge of the chamber with Ghost at his feet. The dire wolf had grown larger over the months, silent and watchful. Davos and Melisandre stood near the table with Stannis, reading the letter. One by one, the barons affixed seals to show their support. Jon's mind turned to Robb Stark again. Would Robb be swayed, or would he cling to the claim of king in the north? Some part of Jon ached at the idea that his brother might reject Stannis. But he had chosen his path, he would follow it through. "We will also move to take Storm's End," Stannis continued. "I shall not leave my family seat in the hands of squatters and would-be usurpers. If Renly stands aside, good. If not, I will face him in battle." The dispatches were sent. Weeks of tense waiting followed. Stannis gathered his small host, preparing ships for the voyage south. During that time, more knights and men-at-arms trickled in, drawn by the rumor of the king's letter. Some hailed from the Stormlands, others from lesser houses in the Crownlands who had grown disillusioned with Joffrey's cruelty. A few from the Reach, tired of the Tyrells' favoritism toward Renly. By the time Stannis was ready to sail, his force had nearly doubled in size. Still paltry compared to what the Lannisters or Tyrells fielded, but enough to make a real attempt at seizing Storm's End, especially if they had help from inside. Jon spent many hours with the captains of the ships, ensuring provisions were stocked, men were organized. The abrupt shift from Black Brother to Royal Advisor was startling. Yet he found he had a knack for managing logistics, a skill that had begun in Winterfell's training yards where he often helped with supplies and the distribution of arms. Stannis did not praise Jon openly, but Davos, with a glint in his tired eyes, told him that the king saw value in Jon's efforts. Melisandre was a constant presence, always claiming the victory was assured if Lawler willed it. She spoke in riddles of dragons and shadows. Jon paid her little heed when it came to prophecy, but he was uneasy each time she seemed to peer into the flames with a secret smile. She told him on one occasion, her voice a soft murmur, "You have your own part to play, Jon Snow. The Lord of Light does not shine his favor on you by accident." Jon bristled. "I know nothing of your God. Know him or not, the fire has touched you," she replied. "There is a power in you that the darkness abhors." He left her presence feeling more unsettled than ever, but he pressed on with his duties. The time came at last to sail. The fleet slipped from Dragonstone under a bright morning sun, the salt wind snapping at the sails. The journey to Storm's End was fraught with storms on the narrow sea, and more than once Jon felt his stomach twist as the deck pitched beneath him. Yet Stannis was determined to reach his ancestral seat and present his claim. If Renly was there, they would confront him. If not, they would install Stannis's garrison. They arrived in the waters off Shipbreaker Bay, battered but intact. Storm's End stood before them, a colossal foe. Fortress perched atop a cliff, defying wind and waves. Jon marveled at the sight. The stories said Storm's End had withstood countless storms and 2 Targaryen sieges. The thick walls and the cunningly curved design made it nearly impregnable. Jon recalled how Ned Stark had once spoken of the fortress with respect, how Stannis had survived a siege there, living on onions and fish, thanks to Davos's smuggling. Looking at it now, Jon believed every word of the stories. The question was whether the castle's defenders would open the gates for Stannis or if a battle awaited them. Messengers were sent ashore under a white banner. For hours they waited, sails flapping in the gusts, gulls crying overhead. Jon paced on the deck, Ghost at his heel, ignoring the sideways glances of the sailors who were not used to direwolves at sea. The men grew anxious, whispering that Renly had come first, or that the Lannisters had installed a garrison. Then, at dusk, the messengers returned with word that the Castellan would open the gates, having sworn loyalty to King Stannis. Of Renly, there was no sign. He had marched inland weeks before, presumably to gather support from the Reach. Stannis's men whooped with triumph. Boats were lowered, and soon the king's forces were scrambling ashore to secure the fortress. Jon joined them, heart pounding, half expecting a trap or an ambush. But they found the gates unbarred, the walls manned by watchful but unhostile soldiers. Within the great courtyard of Storm's End, hundreds of men knelt as Stannis entered, proclaiming him their rightful lord. The Castellan, an older knight with the weary look of a man who had served many masters, bent the knee as well, pledging the castle to Stannis's cause. Though no great battle had been fought, the taking of Storm's End was a significant moral victory. Stannis wasted no time installing men he trusted in positions of command. He took his seat in the castle's great hall, a cold but imposing chamber whose high, vaulted ceiling bore the scars of centuries of storms. Here he held court, speaking with the Stormlords who had pledged fealty, hearing petitions from knights and lords who had come to see this new king in the seat of his ancestors. Jon stood by, quietly observing, occasionally asked for a whispered word by Ser Davos or even by Stannis himself. He noticed the difference in Stannis here. The man was less restless, calmer, as though he had found the anchor of his identity. Dragonstone might have been a refuge, but Storm's End was truly his home. Now that Storm's End was secured, the next step was unclear. Renly and his host were somewhere in the Reach, courting the Tyrells or possibly marching toward King's Landing. Robb Stark was rumored to be making gains in the Riverlands against the Lannisters. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself king of the Isles and the North, adding yet another crown to the chaos. In the midst of so many swirling ambitions, Stannis needed alliances. Yet alliances required compromise, and compromise was not a concept that came easily to Stannis Baratheon. He held a council on one storm-lashed evening, the wind howling outside the thick walls. Torch flames flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the war table. Lords and knights gathered around. Davos was there, Melisandre lingering near the back, eyes half-lidded as though she communed with the flames in the hearth. Jon stood beside her, to keep out of the way of lords with stronger claims to speak. He listened intently as Stannis' newly sworn bannermen debated whether they should march on King's Landing directly or first try to bring Renly to heel. "It may be best to deal with Renly first, my lord," said Lord Penrose. "If he raises the Reach against us, we'll be squeezed between his forces and the Lannisters. We do not have the numbers to fight both. But if we linger too long, Tywin Lannister may crush Robb Stark and turn his full attention to us," argued another. "We must strike at King's Landing and unseat the Lannisters before they can strengthen their hold on the capital. Joffrey's throne is made of lies. Once we display the truth, many will flock to our side." "Or none," a grizzled knight retorted. "People prefer the winning side, not the side that might be right." Stannis' brow knitted in frustration. He looked at Davos. "What say you, Ser Davos?" Davos frowned, glancing at the map. "I've seen the Lannisters fight, your grace. They're cunning, and they have gold enough to hire sellswords if it comes to that. Renly is your brother, so maybe you might convince him to surrender his claim, though I doubt it. He's half the realm's darling, from what I hear. But no matter which way you go, it's a gamble. I wish I could give you better counsel." Stannis nodded, then turned his gaze unexpectedly to Jon. "And you, Snow? Your father was a cunning battle commander, or so Robert always said. What would you do?" Jon swallowed. This was the first time Stannis had called on him so openly in front of so many. He stepped forward, scanning the table. He recalled the war strategies Robb had used. Marching quickly, outmaneuvering the enemy, forging alliances. But this was a different battlefield. If we march on King's Landing without enough men, we risk being crushed by the Lannisters. If we first fight Renly, we might weaken ourselves enough that the Lannisters remain unbeatable. But if Renly is courting the Tyrells, and we leave him unchecked, we could face an army from the Reach. We cannot fight a war on two fronts. Stannis' frown deepened. "So what do you propose?" Jon took a careful breath. "Renly might be approached diplomatically. Offer him a place as heir, should you die without children." He paused, noting Stannis' face harden. "I know it's not an easy suggestion, but sometimes a gesture of peace can avert battle." Stannis' voice was as cold as steel. "Renly is not my heir. My daughter Shireen is next in line. I will not displace her for a younger brother who broke faith with me." Jon inclined his head. "Then perhaps you can treat with him in some other way. Offer him something else. If Renly truly wants to fight for the realm, perhaps he can accept your kingship if you vow certain conditions. Or if that fails, you might attempt a decisive blow against his host. If he's marched far from Storm's End, perhaps we can intercept him or force a confrontation that favors us." Stannis was silent for a moment, regarding Jon with unreadable eyes. Finally, he spoke. "You have a point, and it's more than these lords have given me thus far. I'm not a man for sweet words and feigned pleasantries, but let it not be said I refuse to attempt a truce for the sake of the realm. We will send envoys to Renly. If he spurns me, then we will act. Summon the men, prepare to ride within the fortnight. I grow tired of waiting." The council ended. Some men grumbled that parleying with Renly was a fool's errand, but it was agreed that if a letter or an envoy could sway him, it might save them all much bloodshed. Stannis tasked Davos with sailing to Renly's camp, while a small retinue would ride out from Storm's End. Jon asked if he might join Davos, but Stannis told him to remain. He had other tasks in mind for Ned Stark's bastard. Jon did not protest, though he chafed at the idea of being left behind while Davos risked himself. Over the next few days, rumors of the letter Stannis had sent to all corners of the realm began to trickle back. Some northern lords had declared that they would only follow Robb Stark, who was Ned Stark's heir in their eyes. The Vale remained silent, with Lisa Arryn evidently wanting no part of any war. Dorne had not responded, their intentions murky. But in the Crownlands, a handful of minor houses had declared for Stannis upon reading the revelations of Joffrey's parentage. It was a small victory, yet every letter of support seemed to harden Stannis' resolve. Jon found himself increasingly relied upon to help with negotiations and the organization of supplies. Stannis was not a diplomatic man by nature, so he often looked to Jon or Davos to frame letters or proposals in a manner that would not immediately offend potential allies. Jon strove to reflect the sense of honor and duty that Ned Stark had once shown. He wrote in a straightforward manner, referencing old ties and the laws of succession. Stannis would read over the words, grunt in approval or disgust, then scrawl his signature. As time went on, the men around Storm's End took to calling Jon the King's Scribe or the Black Wolf, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with a hint of grudging respect. When Davos returned from his mission, he brought ill news. Renly was encamped near Bitterbridge with a mighty host, 20,000 men, most of them from the Reach. He had the support of House Tyrell. The Lords of Highgarden had thrown in with Renly in a grand show of pageantry. Banners fluttered, feasts were held. Knights in shining armor flocked to Renly's side. When Davos presented Stannis' offer for negotiations, Renly's response was dismissive at best. He refused to acknowledge Stannis' claim, calling himself the rightful king by virtue of popular support. He believed the realm wanted a bright and merry king, not a stern man like Stannis. Moreover, Renly had married Margaery Tyrell, fortifying his alliance with Highgarden. That was his final answer? Stannis demanded, eyes fixed on Davos. Davos nodded grimly. His lords openly laughed at your offer, your grace. He told me to inform you that you should lay down your arms and bend the knee to him as the realm's chosen king. A hiss ran through the hall. Jon clenched his fists, anger rising on Stannis' behalf. It was a blatant insult, yet anger alone could not solve their predicament. Renly's host dwarfed their own. We will march out, Stannis declared in a voice like thunder. We will find Renly's host and force the matter. If he insists on calling himself king, let him be a king in name only for the remainder of his short life. Summon my lords. The time has come to rid ourselves of pretenders. Preparations began for the march. The castle at Storm's End would remain garrisoned, but Stannis would lead the majority of his forces to confront Renly. Jon watched the flurry of activity, the forging of new weapons, the mustering of cavalry. Knights affixed the burning heart of House Baratheon to their banners. The air bristled with tension. The men knew they were outnumbered. Morale wavered, yet Stannis' unyielding presence stiffened their spines. Melisandre stoked the fires in the castle's sept, praying to her Lord of Light for victory. Before setting out, Stannis summoned Jon to his solar, a sparse chamber with bare walls and a single narrow window overlooking the churning sea. Stannis stood beside the window, hands folded behind his back, his jaw set in that familiar grim line. Jon entered quietly, bowing his head. You sent for me, your grace? Stannis nodded. I did. You have served me better than I expected, Jon Snow. Your father would be proud. Jon felt a pang at the mention of Ned Stark. Thank you, your grace. I only do what I believe is right. As do I, Stannis replied. We march tomorrow. Renly's host is vast, but numbers alone do not always decide battles. We know he's camped near Bitterbridge, but he may move. We must be swift and resolute if we are to stand a chance. I have little taste for sweet words, so I will be plain. This is going to be dangerous. Some would say we ride to our doom. Jon drew a breath, glancing through the window where a roiling sky brooded over the sea. Then I will ride at your side. Stannis turned to him, the firelight from a single lamp reflecting in his deep-set eyes. I do not doubt your courage. Your father's blood runs in your veins. But I have another task for you, one that may prove just as vital, though it keeps you from the battle. Jon's brow furrowed. I'm listening, your grace. The North. Your brother Robb has declared himself king in the North. I need the North if I am to reclaim the Iron Throne. The North has always been strong, and if Robb continues his war against the Lannisters, that serves me well enough for now. But if Robb refuses to bend the knee to the rightful king, we will remain divided. And if we remain divided, the Lannisters or Renly might gain the upper hand. We cannot afford that. Jon felt his heart twist at the thought of opposing Robb. What would you have me do? I want you to go north with a small escort, Stannis said. Speak to your brother. Show him proof of Joffrey's parentage. Appeal to his sense of honor or cunning, whichever it is he responds to. Tell him that if I take the throne, I will name him Warden of the North, but not a king. If that is not acceptable, try to find some arrangement so that the North does not stand in open rebellion against me. If we can coordinate our attacks on the Lannisters or at least not interfere with one another, I will consider that enough for the time being. Jon's pulse hammered. The idea of standing before Robb in his black cloak. No, he was no longer a brother of the Watch, but that was how Robb would remember him. Filled him with a sudden rush of emotion. His mother's face came to mind, the Lady Catelyn Stark, who had never truly accepted him. Sansa, Arya, Bran, Rickon. They were all in turmoil, scattered by war. Could he really go north and treat with them as an envoy of Stannis Baratheon? I will try, your grace. He tried to keep his voice steady. Though I do not know how Robb will receive me. Stannis nodded. Do what you must. If he insists on calling himself king, he is no friend of mine. But I cannot fight a war on all sides. If he will not ally with me, then at least secure a truce. There are larger threats than these petty squabbles. The White Walkers, if half the tales are true, pose a danger to all men. Your place was at the wall, so you know the truth of that threat. Jon blinked, surprised. You believe me about the White Walkers? Stannis's mouth thinned. Melisandre believes. She has seen visions in the flames, visions of a darkness that gathers beyond the wall. It seems I was wrong to dismiss it entirely. But one war at a time, Snow. We cannot save the realm from the dead if we are too busy fighting the living. I place my trust in you to handle this mission. You will ride tomorrow as I march. We shall each face our own battles. Jon felt a weight descend on his shoulders. Yet he also felt a flicker of purpose. Perhaps this was why he'd left the wall, to seek justice, to do something that mattered for the realm. I won't fail you, your grace. Stannis clapped him once on the shoulder. See that you don't. I will give you a token, sealed with my sigil, to show you come as my envoy. Take any men you need, though I can spare few. Ser Axel Florent will command the escort, but you may select a small retinue of your choice from among those who trust you. Go with haste, for time is something we have little of. Jon bowed and left to prepare. That night, he lay awake in the small room he'd been given, thoughts churning like the storm outside. Ghost curled at his feet, a reassuring presence in this dark swirl of uncertainty. Jon ran his hand through the direwolf's snow-white fur and wondered how Robb would react to seeing him again. Would his brother view him as a traitor to the Watch? As a messenger of an unwanted king? Or as Jon Snow, the boy who had grown up in Winterfell's halls, training at Robb's side? At dawn, the courtyard was alive with the clash of arms and the shouts of men. Horses neighed as they were saddled. Soldiers huddled in cloaks, stamping their feet in the chilly wind. Stannis's banners snapped overhead, the crowned stag within the flaming heart. Jon found his small party near the stables. Ser Axel Florent, a haughty man from an ancient lineage, led a handful of mounted knights. A few archers and men-at-arms completed the escort, along with wagons for supplies. Jon had asked for no more than 20 men. They would move faster that way, and if they looked less like an invading force, Robb might be more willing to talk. Before they departed, Stannis approached Jon, mounted on a tall warhorse clad in black barding. "Remember your mission," he said in a voice loud enough for nearby knights to hear. "Tell your brother that if he truly wants justice for Ned Stark, he should take it from Joffrey and his mother, not from me. I am not the one who executed Eddard Stark. Let him remember that. Let him remember, too, that the White Walkers gather in the north and will not wait for our battles to finish." Jon inclined his head. "I will tell him, your grace." Stannis gave a curt nod, then urged his horse forward. His own army began filing out of Storm's End's gates, spears glinting in the pale morning light. Jon watched them go, banners trailing through the archway. He silently prayed for their safety, even Renly's, though he doubted that confrontation would end without bloodshed. The world was turning upside down with each passing day. Brothers fought brothers, kingdoms rose and fell, while the true threat, an ancient, frozen menace, was ignored by all but a few. Ser Axel coughed. "We're ready, Lord Snow." Jon bristled at the title. He was no lord, but he nodded and swung onto his own horse, a black courser he had grown fond of in recent weeks. Ghost loped alongside, silent and graceful. The small column trotted away from Storm's End, heading north. The wind carried the mingled scents of pine and salt. Jon cast one last glance at the fortress, perched on the edge of the sea like a sentinel of old. He thought he saw Melisandre on the battlements, her red hair streaming in the wind, but it might have been a trick of the light. Then the curve of the wall hid the battlements from view, and Storm's End was behind them. The march north was not an easy one, though it was far less grueling than riding from the wall to Winterfell in the dead of winter. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing war, desperate peasants carrying what few belongings they had on rickety carts. Rumors reached Jon's party of Renly's host moving northward, of Lannister forces gathering near Harrenhal, of battles in the Riverlands. Some travelers recognized the flaming heart on the banners and scurried away in fear. Others approached, begging for food or protection from roving bandits. Jon did what he could, distributing some supplies and leaving what coin he had for the neediest, but they couldn't linger or risk being bogged down in every local dispute. They skirted the edges of the Reach, avoiding the main roads that might lead them into Renly's path. Once, they encountered a band of a dozen armed men bearing the golden rose of House Tyrell. Tensions flared, but Jon quickly displayed his envoy's token, explaining they were on a diplomatic mission. The Tyrell men eyed them warily, especially when Ghost prowled forward, baring silent teeth. After a tense exchange, the Tyrell men let them pass. Ser Axel muttered darkly about running them through, but Jon insisted they avoid bloodshed unless necessary. At night, they camped under the stars, setting a double watch. Jon spent hours staring into the darkness, Ghost at his side. Sometimes, in the flicker of the campfire, he thought about Sam Tarly and the other friends he'd left behind at the wall. He wondered if they were safe, if the old bear, Lord Commander Mormont, still led the watch on rangings beyond the wall. Guilt gnawed at him for abandoning his vow, but that vow had become impossible to keep the moment the realm's lords murdered the one man who stood for justice as Jon understood it. Perhaps the old gods would judge him for it, but if the realm fell into the wrong hands, or worse, if the white cold overcame them all, what good were his old vows? Days turned to weeks of travel, as they followed roads that wended around battle lines and lesser skirmishes. Eventually, the familiar sights of the Riverlands gave way to the rolling moors leading toward the Neck. They encountered small pockets of men who wore the direwolf of House Stark on their sleeves, patrolling the roads. Jon breathed easier at the sight of them, though Ser Axel and his knights rode with caution, hands never far from their sword hilts. Finally, one of Robb's outriders intercepted them, a lean man in mail who demanded to know their business in the King in the North's domain. Jon stepped forward, removing his helm so the man could see his face. "I am Jon Snow, son of Eddard Stark, riding under the banner of King Stannis Baratheon as an envoy to the north. I request an audience with my brother, Robb Stark." The outrider stared, recognition and confusion flickering in his eyes. "Jon Snow? But you're of the Night's Watch, or so I'd heard." Jon's throat felt tight. "Not anymore." He handed over Stannis' token and explained his mission in brief. The outrider, uncertain, told them to wait while he rode to inform Lord Stark. As the outrider galloped off, Ser Axel sneered under his breath about northern barbarians, but Jon ignored him. The tension among Stannis' men was palpable. They were far from Storm's End, in territory that might turn unfriendly at a moment's notice. Late the following day, a larger patrol approached under the direwolf banner. At its head was a tall figure astride a brown warhorse. Even at a distance, Jon recognized the posture. Proud. Sure, Robb Stark. His brother's hair was longer now, curling around his ears, and his face was set in a grim mask of command. Grey Wind, Robb's own direwolf, bounded ahead, sniffing the air, hackles rising at the sight of Ghost. Jon felt his heart lurch at the sight of his brother's wolf, memories of Winterfell flooding his mind. Robb reined in his horse a few paces from Jon's party. His bannermen spread out, each armed and wary. Ghost whined low in his throat but remained at Jon's side. Jon dismounted, stepping forward, arms wide in a gesture of peace. Robb looked down at him from his saddle, shock and a flicker of joy warring in his face. "Jon." Robb's voice carried 100 questions in that single word. "What are you doing here? The last I heard, you were at the wall." Jon lowered his head, unsure of how to begin. "It's a long story, Robb, but I've come as an envoy from Stannis Baratheon. He wants to speak with you. Through me." Robb frowned, glancing at Ser Axel's men. The traitor Stannis, who styles himself king while the North defends itself from the Lannisters? Ser Axel bristled, but Jon silenced him with a look. "Stannis is the rightful heir to King Robert, Robb. He's not a traitor. He wants an alliance or at least a truce. The Lannisters killed father. He wants to see them brought to justice. Believe me, Robb's anger flashed. "The Lannisters killed our father, yes, but where was Stannis then? Why didn't he ride to father's aid when father tried to reveal the truth in King's Landing? Where was Stannis when father was imprisoned? Hiding in Dragonstone, doing nothing." Grey Wind snarled, and Ghost answered with a low growl. The tension rose. Jon took a step closer, meeting Robb's eyes, trying to convey sincerity. "I won't argue about what Stannis did or didn't do, but he knows the truth that Joffrey is no Baratheon. He's declared war on the Lannisters, and he wants you to do the same, not as a king, but as the Warden of the North." Robb's lips thinned. "So he wishes me to bend the knee? In exchange for father's old title?" Jon hesitated, knowing how that sounded. "He acknowledges that you and your lords deserve justice and respect. He'll confirm your rights to rule the North as you see fit, so long as you accept him as the rightful king." A flash of wounded betrayal crossed Robb's eyes. He looked down, and for a moment he was no longer the king in the North, but the older brother who had once wrestled in the courtyard with Jon, both boys laughing in the snow. Then the moment passed, and the king's mask returned. "We will speak more, Jon. Bring your men to our camp. But if this is some trick, I will not hesitate to put them to the sword." He paused, voice softening. "It's good to see you alive." Jon swallowed the knot in his throat. "It's good to see you too." They rode together toward the Stark camp, each flanked by their respective men, though they kept a wary distance. The sun began to sink behind the distant hills, painting the sky a bruised purple and gold. As they neared the camp, Jon saw the familiar sigils of the northern houses. The Glover Fist, the Mormont Bear, the Serwyn Battleaxe, and dozens more. The sight felt like a homecoming and a heartbreak all at once. He had missed the North desperately, missed his family, but he had returned as a messenger for a southern king. Within the camp's perimeter, tents were set in neat rows, guards patrolling every path. Robb escorted Jon to the largest tent at the center, dark blue with the direwolf banner fluttering overhead. Lanterns glowed within, casting the outline of men moving about. Jon dismounted and told Ser Axel and the others to remain outside. He took only Ghost with him, who followed silently at his heels. Inside, Robb's closest advisors turned to look at the newcomer. There was the great Jon, Lord Umber, towering over others with a fierce grin. Lord Roose Bolton stood in the corner, his face pale and expressionless. The sight of Bolton made Jon uneasy. He remembered stories about the flayed man of House Bolton and how they had come to Ned Stark's side only grudgingly in the past. There, too, was Lady Catelyn Stark. She froze upon seeing Jon, her eyes widening in recognition before flicking down to Ghost. Jon felt a familiar chill at her presence. She had never once truly welcomed him. A host of other lords stood in attendance, some talking among themselves, some eyeing Jon with curiosity. And beside them all was a bannerman holding the direwolf sigil. Robb moved to the center, removing his gloves. "Mother," he said to Catelyn, voice weary, "Jon has come with a message from Stannis Baratheon." Lady Catelyn's gaze lingered on Jon, her face pinched with old resentment and new worry. "Then let us hear it," she said, voice taut. She nodded at Jon, a bare courtesy but more than he'd come to expect. Jon cleared his throat, conscious that the eyes of half the northern lords were on him. Ghost leaned against his leg, a reassuring presence. "Stannis Baratheon sends greetings to the king in the north," Jon said, forcing a steady tone. "He acknowledges the North's rightful grief and anger at the Lannisters, who murdered Lord Eddard Stark. He asks that you join him in bringing justice to those responsible. In return, he will recognize the ancient rights of the North and name Robb Stark its warden. He seeks unity against the Lannisters, who pose a threat to the realm." A ripple of murmurs passed through the assembled lords. The great Jon spat. "Warden of the North? We've named Robb our king, not some southern crony." Roose Bolton spoke quietly, his thin lips curving in a half-smile. "Stannis Baratheon is said to be a just man. He is also said to be quite stubborn. If we yield our crown, what does he truly offer us that the Lannisters would not? Perhaps a new master's whip is still a whip." Catelyn shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "We have declared for the king in the north. I will not see my son bend the knee to any man, Baratheon or otherwise. Ned died for justice, yes, but we seek our own path now." Jon tried to keep his frustration in check. "I understand. But as king in the north, Robb will have the Lannisters in the west and Stannis in the south. If Stannis triumphs over the Lannisters, will he allow the North to remain independent? There's no guarantee. War is coming from every side, and the dead gather in the far north, beyond the wall." A silence followed. Some of the lords exchanged puzzled glances at the mention of the dead. Robb studied Jon, his expression hard. "What do you know of that threat, Jon?" Jon met his brother's gaze. "More than most. The White Walkers are real and they're stirring. If the realm tears itself apart, who will guard the wall when the real enemy comes?" Robb's jaw tightened. He looked at his mother. Lady Catelyn said nothing, her face betraying a flicker of concern. It was one thing to hear old stories of white shadows. It was another to see so many men set on war. Robb finally turned back to Jon. "You want me to yield my title as king, to place myself under Stannis' rule, because of the threat of the Lannisters and these White Walkers?" Jon clenched his fists. "I'm saying that if the realm remains divided, we may all lose. If the Lannisters destroy us one by one, or if Renly does, or if the White Walkers come down upon a fractured kingdom, there will be no one left to fight. At the very least, we need a truce. Stannis does not wish to fight the North. He wants an end to the Lannisters' reign of terror." The northern lords erupted in overlapping arguments. The great Jon roared that no man living would make the North kneel again. Lord Bolton pointed out that cunning bargains might save thousands of northern lives. Others argued about the readiness of their forces, the distance to King's Landing, the alliances in the Vale. Jon stood there, feeling torn. He wanted to side with his brother, to stand as a Stark in the circle of northern loyalty. But he had pledged himself to Stannis, had believed in the man's claim. Ghost pressed against his leg, as though sensing his turmoil. Robb finally raised his hand for silence. The tent quieted, aside from the rustling of canvas in the wind. "I will not dismiss your words out of hand, Jon, nor will I ignore the threat you claim is rising in the North. But the men here have declared me king in the North, and I will not dishonor them by simply yielding that title upon the first offer from a southern lord. Yes, even if that lord is my father's friend." Jon's chest tightened. "Your Grace, what would you have me say to Stannis?" Robb's gaze shifted around the tent. "Tell him I will not kneel. If he wishes to treat with me, then let us discuss a mutual alliance as equals, king to king. The North bled for Robert Baratheon in his rebellion, and we were rewarded with a father who was executed by his so-called queen. We will not bleed again to see another Baratheon crowned over us. But if Stannis truly wants the Lannisters overthrown, I can promise you we share that common cause." Lady Catelyn spoke then, calm steel in her tone. "We will not set aside our grievances. Ned's murder demands justice. But we will not ally ourselves blindly. Let Stannis prove his worth in battle, let him topple the false king, and then perhaps the North will discuss terms that respect our independence. Otherwise, we stand alone." She gave Jon a long, cool look. "My lord," she said, a bare courtesy, then turned away. Jon realized this was as close to compromise as Robb would come. He had not threatened to fight Stannis outright, nor had he accepted Stannis's overlordship. But he had left the door open for a potential alliance, one that recognized the North's sovereignty. It was more than Jon had feared, less than Stannis had hoped. Robb spoke again, quieter, directed at Jon. "We can speak more in private, brother. For now, rest. I'll have a tent set aside for you and your escort. I trust you will respect the laws of hospitality while you remain in my camp." Jon nodded, exhaling slowly. "Of course." Robb dismissed the other lords, who filed out in various states of muttering. Catelyn lingered a moment, giving Robb a worried look, then left as well. Soon, only Robb and Jon remained, along with Grey Wind and Ghost. The two direwolves eyed each other uneasily. Robb turned to his half-brother, letting out a breath. For a moment, the weight of kingship seemed to slip from his shoulders. He reached out and clasped Jon's arm, pulling him into an embrace. Jon stiffened, then returned it, overwhelmed by a sudden rush of memories. Childhood laughter, sparring in the yard, the quiet evenings by the fireplace in Winterfell. "It's good to see you, truly," Robb murmured, stepping back. "When we heard of the troubles at the Wall, and then your disappearance, I feared the worst." Jon swallowed. "I never meant to desert you or the Watch. After Father's death, I couldn't just stay there, waiting, doing nothing." Robb nodded sadly. "I understand. Father would have told you to do your duty, but I can't say I wouldn't have done the same in your place. He was your father as much as mine." Jon's eyes burned. "I'm sorry I didn't stand with you when you raised your banners." Robb managed a small smile. "You stand with me now, or at least I hope you do. I won't try to sway you from your new loyalties. But," he paused, as though searching for the right words, "you're still my brother." Jon nodded fiercely. "Always." They stood in silence, the howling wind rattling the tent. Outside, Jon heard the heavy footsteps of men passing, the clang of a hammer striking an anvil as the North readied for the next battle. Robb was so young to be called a king, but war spared no one. Finally, Robb lifted the tent flap. "Go rest. We'll talk more in the morning." Jon left, Ghost at his side, feeling as though 1,000 ravens swirled in his mind. He had carried Stannis's message north, and Robb had replied with a cautious rebuff. Another war was brewing, perhaps multiple wars. And all the while, the White Walkers stirred in the distant darkness. As he approached the tent assigned to him, the clamor of northern voices and the smell of cookfires reminded him of home. Yet this was no true homecoming. He was an envoy in a camp of warriors, uncertain where his future lay. Ser Axel waited outside the tent, arms crossed. "Well," Jon summarized what had transpired. The Florent knight huffed. "As expected. The boy fancies himself a king. This is a fool's errand." Jon didn't reply, too exhausted to argue. He slipped inside the tent, Ghost following. His men-at-arms were quiet, some trying to sleep, others dicing by lantern light. They glanced at Jon but said nothing as he found a corner to lay out his bedroll. Weary beyond words, he sank down. Ghost curled beside him. He closed his eyes but found no peace, only a swirling chaos of half-formed dreams. Ned Stark's voice echoing in a chamber he did not recognize, Stannis standing atop the wall with a sword of fire, Robb wearing a crown of ice that melted into blood. When morning came, there would be more words exchanged. More attempts at bridging the gulf between King Stannis and King Robb. But no matter the outcome, Jon Snow knew that his own fate was entwined with theirs. He had left the Wall to seek justice for Ned Stark, and now he found himself perched on the edge of a war that might tear the realm apart. Honor, duty, family, these were the watchwords that guided him, yet each pulled him in a different direction. The path before him was uncertain and fraught with danger, but he would follow it all the same, for the North, for the realm, and for the memory of the only father he had ever known.